Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this Google Hangout on homegrown extremism. I am Fuzz Hogan, managing editor here at New America. We're joined today by Shane Harris, senior writer at Foreign Policy and Arizona State Future of War fellow here at New America. Hi, Shane.
Hi.
And Margaret Hu, an assistant professor of law at Washington and Lee University School of Law. Hello, Margaret.
Hello.
Reminder to all of you watching at home, or at your desk at work, more likely, we're taking your questions, so please tweet at New America or use our hashtag, Homegrown Hangout. That seems really scary, a Homegrown Hangout. Those things happen, I think, somewhere.
It's the Halloween spirit.
The Homegrown Hangout.
Very spooky.
So we have the events in the Canadian Parliament recently, Shane. We have a guy who shot and killed a soldier, and we have a sense that he had a connection to jihadism. And so, much like Ebola, people have decided to, let's do something.
Right.
We need to stop this threat. And in Canada, that is asking the CSIS, Canadians' version of the NSA, to do something. So give us a briefing on what that is, how that's different from where it is here, and get us started.
Sure. Well, the do something is actually a proposal that had been floating around in Canada in weeks before, and even a few days before senior officials had talked about it. That basically what they want to be able to do is to allow their version of the Signals Intelligence Service, the NSA, to more closely track the communications of Canadians when they go abroad. And sort of the impetus for this more recently has been this concern in Canada that there are Canadians who are traveling abroad and joining up with the Islamic State or ISIS or ISIL or however you want to call them, the people going to Syria, potentially becoming radicalized, coming back and launching attacks. The desire has been for Canada to be able to monitor them more closely and to be able to share the information that they're gathering with larger intelligence agencies, namely the United States and the British. What's interesting here is that they were actually doing some of that, possibly against the judge's orders, in fact, in some cases. So there was a kerfuffle about this in 2013. The intelligence services in Canada kind of got slapped back, and ever since then the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party largely have been pushing this expansion of surveillance, which they would see as sort of legalizing the things that they were doing anyway, a bit outside the judge's orders. And the shootings have definitely breathed new life into that. So not long after, in fact, the night of the shooting last week, Prime Minister Harper went on national television in Canada and promised a redoubling of the efforts to pass not only surveillance legislation, but legislation that would enhance the powers of the Canadians to arrest and detain terrorist suspects. And this is, you know, in the United States, we're sort of used to these laws, I mean, enacted by the Patriot Act and the FISA Reform Acts of the past few years. This is something really quite new in Canada. There's not really a robust system of surveillance and certainly not of arrest and detention the way we have it in the U.S. here. So the shootings really became sort of a catalyzing effort for the Conservatives to start pushing really hard to get this through.
So Margaret, typically this conversation after a briefing like that, or after a moment like that, it focuses on whether we should allow surveillance from a privacy standpoint. Should my phone records be harvested with everyone else's? But to some degree, that's actually downstream from an assumption that it works. So let's go back upstream and find out whether, before we talk about whether we should have surveillance, just to sort of turn those things on the traditional conversation on its head, would they actually be effective in stopping Michael Zahav-Bibo?
Yeah, I think that that's a very important question, and that was one of the main questions that Snowden said he was asking that motivated him to lead to the disclosures when he said, do these programs work, and two, are they constitutional? So on the question of whether or not these programs work, I think we really need to interrogate the methods. And is it really anchored? Are these mass cyber surveillance programs or big data cyber surveillance programs anchored in any sort of scientific method? And my research has shown basically that these programs don't work, that there are fundamental problems with big data that make the big data tools of statistical algorithms and predictive analytics very ill-suited for predicting crime or terrorism before it occurs, that we're basically in an attempt to create a preventative paradigm and stop crime and terrorism before it happens, that we think if we just collect it all and we do these mass data analytics, that we can see some type of pattern and then stop the criminal or the potential terrorist before they commit that act. But the science just doesn't bear that out, and the research doesn't bear that out.
So, and I'll ask both you guys, because it sounds like then, so this notion that we can sort of Mark Zuckerberg our way to safety by just harvesting a bunch of stuff and figuring out what the best patterns are doesn't work. It's also consistent with what the research our International Security Program has found here. Is the same thing, that of all that they've studied most of the homegrown terrorism attacks, and that it's traditional police work, right? It's the same stuff that we've been using with some technical enhancements since Joe Friday.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's largely true. And people I've talked to for many years in the intelligence and the law enforcement community will tell you that if you bring the sort of mass surveillance apparatus that we're describing here to bear on a single person or on a single lead of information, say a phone number that you recover from the cell phone of a dead militant in Syria, and you put that surveillance system to work on that one piece of data, you can find out a lot about that person. You can follow those trails. But it's this sort of preemptive idea of let's collect all the data and see if we can discern patterns. The intelligence agencies in this country have been trying for a number of years to do that, and that just really doesn't work. We don't have any hard evidence it works. The science, as we were just saying, suggests it doesn't work. In the Canadian context, what's interesting is, you have to compare them to that sort of surveillance system that we've built in the U.S. It's like apples and oranges. It's so primitive compared to what we do. What they're looking for, at least initially, is this ability to say, we want to be able to follow specific Canadians when they go overseas and track their communications.
So that should not, Margaret, or that should not change the basic nature of privacy. In other words, if you've done something that announces yourself as sort of somewhat under suspicion, if a judge writes a warrant, right?
Right.
Is that a change? Is that the same as we already have? Like, we need to change laws at all?
Right. Well, I think that's an important distinction, because big data is about predictive analytics. Right. So it's about collecting the evidence before there is a crime or an act of terrorism. And basically, it's been called putting a haystack before the needle approach, that you build the haystack, you presuppose that there's a needle in there, and then you go after an imagined presupposed terrorist that you think is in that haystack of data. And so it's very controversial. Can we predict crime or terrorism before it occurs? And I wanted to really point any of your viewers to the excellent research of the New America Foundation. And your research seems to point to that the mass surveillance technologies of the NSA have potentially foiled one terrorist suspect, whereas old-fashioned small data surveillance methods have then led to potentially 149. And so that's a huge difference.
Good neighbors. I mean, David Sturman's written a piece for Weekly Walk about how it's just basically tips from neighbors, people suspicious, that kind of stuff, right? And then, either one of you again, I know enough about organizations and motivation that if you've spent a lot of money, as you say, gathering that, hey, darn it, you're going to find the needle because you're going to rationalize how much time and effort you put into it. So there may be people popped up out of that process who aren't even guilty, but we've got to find somebody guilty in here because there ought to be a needle. Is that fair? Am I being too suspicious?
I think that, on the law, I would sort of separate that out by domestic U.S. law enforcement versus the intelligence community, which is largely pointing its sensors in this context overseas. In the U.S., I mean, it's fair to say, I think, that counterterrorism investigations, law enforcement investigations, are more closely monitored and controlled by a judge than the sort of potential broad fishing expedition that the NSA might be engaged in, say, if they were surveilling in Yemen or in Iraq, for instance, when we had forces in Iraq. And there, the concern has been that in the course of monitoring these foreign communications, it's impossible to separate Americans' communications from those as well. And so we cast a big net, and the NSA will say, well, we're doing that in a foreign context aimed at foreign people because we need a warrant to look at an American, but all of that data that gets scooped up about Americans is now in the system. And in certain cases, retroactively, they can go back and look at that without a warrant because it was presumed to be legally collected in the first place. So, whether or not false leads lead to false assumptions, I mean, that's, I think, a risk of investigations that there's always been. You can start to build a case against someone that looks very persuasive and convincing based on evidence that's just not sound. And in the big data context, we have to be very careful of things like false negatives, guilt by association, patterns that look meaningful but actually aren't. And that's where, again, the technology has not become refined to some level where we can just look at a big data set and know who the bad guy is. You have to have more concrete leads and tips and information than that.
Shane, you written a piece on foreignpolicy.com about surveillance law in Singapore, a place you have visited. What are they doing that's different? Could other people? You think other countries might take that up as a model?
Well, Singapore it's fascinating because they've sort of taken surveillance to a whole new domain. They do, and when we say surveillance in Singapore, we're talking largely about things like surveillance cameras, which of course are not unique to Singapore, by the way. I think London and New York maybe have more cameras than Singapore does. Of course, it's a very tiny nation. But we're talking about their monitoring of internet communications for prohibited content, cybersecurity kind of monitoring to make sure that government systems aren't being threatened by hackers. But what they've done is taken it not just to applying it to national security, how can we find threats, how can we find criminals, potential terrorist actors, but they do this kind of surveillance for monitoring for potential disease outbreaks. They apply big data analytics towards policy planning in housing and immigration. I mean, it really is a country that has taken this whole idea of the promise of big data analysis and tried to apply it to a host of problems and challenges. And there, I think that it's a lot of countries, particularly in the U.S., the intelligence community looks at that and they're sort of fascinated by it because they can collect data on a scale that maybe we can't in this country because of some of our laws preventing it domestically. But we shouldn't read too much into the success that Singapore might have because it's a very small country, it's a closed society, and a lot of times what happens is these big data programs don't really scale up. So you're talking about in the U.S., in a country of some 300 million people, vastly geographically dispersed, people coming in from all different ports of entry. We shouldn't think that a surveillance system that works for security in Singapore would even be analogous to one in the United States.
Reminder to tweet us your questions at New America, hashtag Homegrown Hangout. I'm in a Homegrown Hangout. Also sounds like a pot legalization hangout.
Yeah, that could work.
We should actually advertise that and get people going, what are they talking about?
Now they'll really talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. So John Smith on Twitter, I think we answered your question about whether mass surveillance makes us safer. I think the answer to that, at least according to the Hangout here so far, is no. But feel free to tweet us again if we misinterpreted your question. Mike, and I'm going to apologize in advance. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Parian asks on Twitter, and it's a little bit cryptic. It seems like Canada is trying to, quote, double down, unquote. I guess it's back to the original question. Is this a reaction to a problem, and if it doesn't solve the problem, how do we sort of, I guess, assuage our fear? I mean, what's the best way to, and I have another question following that to drill down on that, but let me ask that in a sort of bald way or an open way. Is Canada doing what most countries do when they suffer an attack? Just, let's do something.
Yeah, I think that this is going to be a common response, that as soon as there's an attack, there's this impulse to do something. And that something, I think, a lot of governments see as mass surveillance. If you have these big data tools, why not use them?
And so yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Finn.
No, it's very seductive, I think, that you're going to think that they work. If it works for Target, if it works for Amazon, if it works for Google, why wouldn't it work in the national security context? And the problem is the research just isn't there.
So would it be more effective, and maybe you guys, I apologize if this isn't either one of your field of expertise, but James Sheehan's asking, would it be better to develop non-prosecution-oriented, counter-radicalization programs? In other words, are there ways, although it's kind of tough to sort of reach every single audience, potential jihadi everywhere, but it would be more effective to actually try to counter radicalism more than police it. It's to take it to the school analogy. Is it better to have more counselors in a high school or have, magnetic, metal detectors?
Yeah, I think I'm glad he asked that question because to me that is the more important question or set of questions to be asking after the events in Canada. And we're talking about in the context of so-called homegrown terrorism. Let's remember too that Canada has not really had, certainly not since the 9/11 attacks, an event like this one. And so it's tempting to perhaps see this as the start of some kind of a trend or of a wave, but it's entirely possible that this was just anomalous, and it happened once, and it may never happen again. And as terrible as it was, thankfully more people were not hurt. It was not a sophisticated, organized attack. In the U.S., law enforcement has been worried for a long, long time about so-called lone wolves and homegrown terrorism. We really haven't had a problem with that here. You tend to see more issues of it in European countries and in England, and generally I think the sort of social science explanation for that is because, at least in the United States, there's a greater tendency for immigrants to assimilate and to kind of become American, or and to not necessarily detach from their their mother country or their cultures, but to kind of get into the melting pot, and that there seems to be sort of more isolation in places like France or in England. I mean, tellingly, a lot of the ISIS videos that we've seen, these beheading videos and some of the other jihadi videos, are really pointing back towards England and calling upon their brothers in arms in England to rise up. Where I think that ISIS knows it has probably more of a foundation of potential radicals. So that is the big question: is how do you counter that problem? And I mean, and that's obviously you can't throw surveillance at that, and that's just a huge long-term set of challenges. But I think it's important that we not try to equate Canada with what's happening in other places where I think this is more of a pronounced threat.
All right. And 9/11 hijackers were radicalized in Germany, at least the leadership of that plot.
Sure, and I mean, and radicalized, I mean, in their upbringing as well. And I mean, that's it was certainly a transcontinental kind of effort in that respect.
This is aiming toward you, Shane, but I'm both Margaret and you can answer it. It sort of goes to also how we're engaging with ISIS now as an analogy. Is the future of surveillance tech-oriented or boots on the ground? The way Michael DeRamo asks it on Twitter is big data only about predictive algorithms? Is it not also an attempt to skip the step of recovering a cell phone? And I think Margaret's already answered that we have to really lead with boots on the ground and use tech as a complement. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say that you need to have some human intelligence in the methods, in the decision making, and then finally in the accountability. So if you don't have human judgment involved, if you go to a fully automated system, I think you're opening up a whole can of worms, and Shane had already mentioned some of them. Pattern-based analysis really leads to things like guilt by association. It leads to guilty until proven innocent. It really undermines a lot of fundamental aspects of what we consider justice and constitutional principles. And so I don't think that we can go to just a statistical-based type of national security policy or a predictive analytics model for counterterrorism.
You get right to Patty de la Puente's question on profiling, right? Studies seem to show no across-the-line consistency in profile of foreign jihadists that want to join ISIS. Other radicals and other radicals. Doesn't it make it incredibly difficult to tackle the increasing trend? In other words, if we were to harvest data and find a correlation or an association with the behavior that is employees of a certain fast food joint or attendees of a certain mosque, we would then be profiling against the larger population of those people who aren't radicalized. Is that a fair fear? Is that something we should be worrying about, Shane?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that is what you want to worry about, is casting such a broad net that you're sort of modeling a lot of assumptions on how people will behave because of their association with a particular mosque or a city. The people who I know who really dug into this, and particularly in law enforcement, will say is that in that sense profiling doesn't work. That what you need to be able to do is have really solid leads in human intelligence and be able to link people together based on known bad affiliations. Like, this bad guy is talking to these people, and not to rely on statistical correlation, but real investigative shoe leather kind of work to find out if those connections are meaningful. What happens in a data mining context is data mining, in its technical definition, is really about statistical correlation. And I think people who believe that big data can work in a surveillance context, the ones who I think are really smart about it anyway, will say, but we can't ever get to a point where we allow statistical relevance or statistical correlation to be the deciding factor about whether this person who's connected to this person, they're both bad guys. That you have to be able to investigate that. And I think some of the more even ambitious programs that were suggested after 9/11, one that I've written a lot about, was called the Total Information Awareness Program. It never really got off the ground fully, but there too it was a system that imagined sucking up all of this data and looking for patterns. But as you got closer to meaningful patterns, the human beings would come in and do the analytic work. Now, how do you counter for a human being willing to overrule the judgment of a computer program. I mean, we didn't quite get that far with total information awareness, but it at least envisioned human beings having a role and making the decisions and not simply relinquishing all of that to a computer or to an algorithm.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point that I wanted to follow up on, that part of the problem with big data analytics is that there's a certain path dependency to it. Once you engage in that type of pattern-based analysis or statistical algorithmic method, you want to find a result. You will get a result. You will program the system to find some type of target. It might be very precise in its correlation, but there might not be any cause or effect. And you might then just lead the big data user astray in the national security context if you have it fully automated. Another problem with big data analytics is bigger data is usually messier data. So as you layer databases upon data sets, upon other raw data, unstructured data, then you have less predictive value. And that's part of the problem with a system such as total information awareness. Theoretically, maybe you think that by having more data, all the data that you could possibly have to analyze, to search for this pattern-based analysis, you'll get to the target. But in reality, you won't.
Yeah, it's like you assign a cop to solve a murder. Gosh darn it, he's going to find a suspect to clear that case. And so this is the same. That if you give someone all these fancy tools, they're going to find something to have rationalized the expense and the time they've spent on doing it. One last shout out for questions at New America, but let me ask Margaret. Stephen Harper has called you and said, "Can you prevent the next one of these attacks, or help me design a system to keep Canadians safer?" What's your first answer to that question, to that request?
Well, I think that we have to then look at the limits of big data cyber surveillance, and we have to go to the benefits of human intelligence and small data surveillance. So I would say that you need boots on the ground, you need to have human and judgment involved in whatever statistical models that you do decide to use. You're going to have some type of accountability process. You're going to need to be able to have some type of due process or appeal process before you take action against individuals. And so you have to build in a certain structure, I think, of protections if you're going to go towards a more statistical, analytical, big data approach to surveillance and intelligence gathering. But what I would highly encourage him to do is really think very deeply about going to a small data investigative approach where you use human intelligence and human detective work.
So Shane, you're writing a book about how we're going to wage war in the future. Predict for me, 5-10 years, what's going to be different about how we engage in this behavior, intelligence gathering and law enforcement behavior that we don't know about yet?
I think that you're seeing the trend going towards, collect as much information as possible, and whether you intend to store it for future use or analyze it now, that's kind of the way that we're going. Interestingly, we're a year and a half now, I guess, after the Snowden revelations in the U.S., which of course exposed surveillance in all the countries we've been talking about, mostly in the U.S. though. And there really aren't significant legislative proposals out there right now to curtail this kind of mass bulk data collection, with the exception of maybe some modifications to the so-called metadata program, the phone records program. But that's really just, a piece of what Snowden was exposing and what a lot of journalists have written about. I just think that these things have a momentum of all of their own, and that technology has, in this context, kind of shown an inexorable march towards becoming more integrated into the investigative process and into the analytic process. I think you're going to see more of that, not less. Kind of another way of looking at this too, though, is a cautionary example. Is if taking the Harper question, what would you tell him? As I understand it, the system that existed in Canada, well, two things. One, it would not have necessarily caught this individual or another guy who is believed to have used his car to run over 2 soldiers, because the system was not aimed domestically. It was aimed towards foreign individuals. But the way that the system had been set up was such that a judge was allowing specific targeted monitoring of individual Canadians who had gone overseas. So very much in that kind of small data context that we're talking about. A judge okayed that. Where Canada got into trouble was when officials were found out to have been sharing information that they were gleaning with the NSA and with GCHQ, the British equivalent, that is known for the kind of more big data, large-scale collection. And the Canadian judge really sort of flipped out over this and said, no, 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 this is the kind of thing we don't want to be associated with. There's a real resistance towards that kind of participation in Canada for fear that if the Canadian services start handing over the names of Canadians to the Americans, that they will end up on drone strike lists. That's really what's at the root of this, or that they will end up in a black site someplace. Not that we have black sites per se in that way anymore, but that's why the judge really resisted this. So there was a very sort of targeted small data system in place in Canada. I guess the authorities felt that it wasn't working good enough. I mean, I don't know why. We still don't know enough about why they felt that that wasn't enough and they wanted to go farther. But you at least kind of had those constraints in place at some point. And there weren't any terrorist events in Canada until now, and the ones that we had wouldn't have been caught by that system anyway.
And that's the great way to wrap it. Thank you both very much. Thank you all for watching I forgot an alliterative opportunity, the Halloween Homegrown Hangout. Special thanks to our guests Shane Harris in Foreign Policy, Margaret Hu from Washington Lee Law School. Enjoy trick-or-treating. We're having a Halloween party here in a matter of minutes here at New America early. But otherwise, have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And be sure to visit our website, newamerica.org, and follow us at New America and read our digital magazine. This will be featured tomorrow, The Weekly Wonk, at weeklywonk.org. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Fuzz.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.